May only the truth be spoken, may only the truth be heard, and may the truth be ever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. My truth is that I felt very uncomfortable while listening to this passage. There is a lot of trouble in today's gospel passage. The story is a detailed account of the events that led to the execution of John the Baptist, and there are a variety of injustices in it. John is not executed because he commits some violent crime. He is not executed for theft. He's executed because he criticized those in power. And to add to the injustice, his execution was not how Herod had intended to handle the situation. Instead, the order of execution was given because Herod found himself in a compromising position. There are a variety of forces that attempt to turn people away from God's message. This story shows that these forces were at work within King Herod. Mark's gospel states that Herod liked to listen to John. It states that Herod only agreed to have John beheaded after he had promised anything to his daughter. This scenario illustrates a more complicated form of evil. Herod wasn't portrayed as instinctually cruel or mean-spirited. Instead, he was portrayed as weak and willing to engage in cruel behavior to placate those around him and to maintain his own power. It shows him as lacking the wisdom to avoid getting into compromising situations where he was vulnerable to being pressured into cruelty and unjust behavior. Now, although I see forces affecting Herod, I do not consider him to be a victim in this story. However, when I read this passage, I felt worried about finding myself in the role of Herod. I found myself thinking about what it means to be in a position of power or privilege and choose to allow or ignore injustices knowing that they are wrong. And with all the stuff in the news about the residential schools, this passage had me wrestling and feeling very frustrated. I felt frustrated because it feels like we're still hearing stories of pain. It feels like to speak of this again just reminds people of something that is already upsetting. It feels like I'm just adding more words that won't help to solve the problem. And most of all, it's frustrating because the injustices continue. So I watched news videos and read stories about the uncovering of these unmarked graves. I was hoping to find new information since I last spoke about this, or something that might provide some comfort. But in many ways, it's the same painful stories that we've been hearing in the news for weeks now. Actually, it's the same frustration that has been going on for many years. For many people, these are lifelong stories of pain. I can remember first hearing about residential schools when I was in elementary school, and that was almost 20 years ago. I remember hearing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission throughout high school and university, and I can remember people feeling hurt, angry, and confused then. Stories related to the work of Truth and Reconciliation have continued to be told throughout most of my life, and new stories are going to continue to come out. And I believe that we cannot afford to turn away from these stories. It would be easy for me to say that I was only 6 when the last residential school closed down. It would be easy to say that I was not the person in power who made those terrible decisions that led to so much suffering. But the reality is that the residential schools were something that the Anglican Church participated in along with other churches. It's something that our nation of Canada participated in and led. It's something that we are going to continue to face for a while. it would be easy to point a finger of blame to another and say, that person is responsible for causing harm. But today's gospel puts the viewer in Herod's perspective. It reminds us that we can find ourselves in situations where, despite whatever power or authority we have, we either find ourselves pressured to make the wrong choice, or we find ourselves haunted by the suffering of others. But today's gospel also shows us that death is not the end of John the Baptist. The story plays around with timelines a little bit here. Today's story is a flashback. It begins by telling us that when Herod heard about the ministry of Jesus, he thought he was hearing about John the Baptist. Herod thought that John the Baptist had returned from the dead, and that filled him with fear. So this story looks back at an injustice. I think that this story reminds us that injustices have a way of returning. There are aspects of death that seem so final, but this story contradicts that. Now, the graves that have been uncovered have not returned the children from the dead. But something like a resurrection has occurred. God has resurrected a hunger for justice. People are angry, and people are crying for justice. Now, fear, anger, and frustration can lead people to make bad decisions. But I also think that these emotions are normal responses when we hear about things like the execution of John the Baptist or all those unmarked graves. Those emotions of anger, fear, and frustration, they remind me of a phrase, righteous indignation. That is, that feelings of anger at a situation because of the injustice of it. However, I believe that God will give us more than the anger, the fear, the frustration, the pain. God will give us more than the righteous indignation. I don't know what that will be, so I listen. I listen to the stories that are coming out in the news, and I listen to the calls for action, and I listen to people like Archdeacon Val Kerr, who has said that before we can have reconciliation, we need to have the truth. And in the meantime, I remember something that Winston Churchill said. Very soon after he became prime minister, he stated, "I have little to offer but blood, sweat, and tears." At first glance, this is not an optimistic statement. But acknowledging the difficulties of the upcoming struggles was a large part of how Churchill was able to lead people through the Second World War. Churchill also said that the first casualty of war is the truth. Now, that was a very different situation from what we are facing now. However, I think that these two statements by Churchill are applicable to our current events. We are facing some significant difficulties with the uncovering of these unmarked graves, and we will continue to face some difficulties as more stories come to light. We don't need to face this by fighting. Instead, we need to face this with the courage to listen for the truth and to offer support as it becomes more clear what forms of support will be needed. Today's gospel, today's good news, shows us that God continues to renew the human desire for justice, no matter who or what challenges it. As we face these challenges, I would like to close with the serenity prayer of God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change what we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.